So thank you for the invitation to be part of this Remember the Poor series. I'll be honest, I was honored, but I was also a little bit intimidated. I feel like the reason that I do the work that I do, my faith, and recognizing that there is a responsibility of faith in action in my life, particularly a response to those who are the least of these. But I usually have practiced that work in more secular settings, so I don't get a chance to share as much from the faith perspective. And I'm also Catholic, so we have a priest who does most of the preaching. I don't, as a lay religious, get to practice as much. So this is a chance for me to burnish those skills a little bit, but as I said, I'm not seasoned, so just bear with me there. The passage that I selected for you is one that really has spoken to me my whole life. And that is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, the passage, the judgment of the nation. So I'll share that with you now, and then offer a reflection on that passage. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people, one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you as a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it when we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will also answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. So I chose this passage for a number of reasons. As I'm sure is clear to all of you, it's one of the most explicit messages from our Lord about our responsibilities to one another. But it's also one of the most challenging. We're left wondering, if I don't do these things, then I am truly not loving God with my whole heart and soul. And then I think that opens up a false temptation, that to truly love God, we have to start doing a honey-do list, basically, from Jesus. We have to do all these activities. But to me, it's not just about the activities. Yes, the service to our fellow men and women is worthy, it's important, and as you probably heard this past month, it is necessary because our community does have need. But the real meaning is less about the doing in and of itself and more about the attitude. It's the orientation of the heart that should lie beneath the doing. It's about an attitude of hospitality and compassion towards people whose experiences are different than our own. It's about relationships with others that in turn leads to a deeper relationship with Christ. In my work at Tabor, we often talk about this idea of walking alongside others or accompanying people who are facing hardships. At the core of that idea of walking along is that the individuals who are struggling are in the driver's seat of their own lives. We as the social service providers are advocates, we're resource specialists, or we're coaches. We can teach people new skills, like a coach does, or connect them to a resource that might be useful to help them achieve their goal. But fundamentally, the hard work of making progress towards one's goals, of finding secure housing, of making it out of poverty, that work will be done by the individual. We are there alongside. We don't ask them to walk that journey alone, but we cannot do for others. We can do in partnership with others. So when I think about that idea of accompaniment or walking alongside that we talk about in a social work setting, I see that it translates really well to a spiritual setting as well. I think to the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus said to us, we start that prayer with an Our Father. So that immediately puts all of us in connection to each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. There's no getting around that. For brothers and sisters in Christ, we have a responsibility to be there for another. And what that means is really that we're saying that I see the dignity in you as a son or daughter of Christ. And that dignity flows from God. And that action of love that I can show you is also a way that I can show love for Christ. I had this really illustrated for me in a powerful way when I was a college student. I was really inspired and troubled by what was happening in the U.S. immigration system and on our border. And sadly, as you all know, we still have that challenge. But I spent some time in Tijuana, Mexico, working with a faith-based organization that was providing hospitality to migrants. And I also visited some other cities on the U.S.-Mexico border, trying to learn more about this and trying to understand all the different sides of this complicated issue. But I had a conversation in El Paso, Texas, with this woman who was staying at a shelter called Annunciation House. She had recently crossed the border. There was a lot of hardships on that journey. Some people in her party did not make it. And she made a comment during our conversation that has literally just stuck with me and really, gnawed at my soul. Like I just can't get it out of my head. She said, "Así es la vida de los pobres." She said, that is what life is like for the poor. It was almost like she had some resignation to her suffering. And I thought to myself then, but does it have to be? That's not the whole story. That can't be the whole story. We can do something. So I came back to my campus and I was fired up. I was trying to understand, what can we do about these issues? And that fire has not really been squelched. I think it's been channeled in a way. But it was really sort of, I think, part of me hearing the call to serve others. I had a chance in my career later on helping college students when I was working at Loyola University down in Baltimore. And they were kind of wrestling with these same issues. And as part of my instruction to them, I came across this great resource that I want to share with you today that I think really gives us a useful metaphor to how to think about translating Matthew 25 into our everyday lives. And it's this metaphor of the 2 feet of faith in action. So the version that I'm familiar with comes from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, but I'm sure there's other resources out there. And if anyone's curious, I can send you more information about it. But so think about your 2 feet. You've got 1 foot. That's the foot of charitable acts. That's service. That's responding to the immediate needs of people who are struggling. Then you've got another foot, and that foot is justice. So that is the foot that's looking at the conditions that lead people to experience poverty, homelessness, hunger. And that's saying, well, we can change those conditions. You can't move forward unless you're working on both feet. So you need to embrace, as a Christian, both the charity and the justice work. So I'm going to ask you to do a little thought experiment with me. So imagine that you're walking down a path. Oftentimes in prayer, we are invited to a conversation with Jesus. So imagine that you're preparing for that conversation. You can see Jesus up ahead of you on the path. You're walking towards him. But then you notice there's another person on the path between you and Jesus. It's someone who seems a bit disheveled, maybe a little bit dirty. I think in our popular imagination, as a society, we have a sense of what quote-unquote homelessness looks like. In my work at Tabor, I know that it's a much more complicated picture, but think about when you think of the word homeless, what does that look like to you? That's the person who's up there on the road. Then a little bit further down the path, you see another group of people, and this is a group of children, and behind the children is a parent, and that parent is behind bars. And then you look a little further and you see someone in a hospital bed. So you've got your 2 feet of faith in action. You've got your service foot, your justice foot. You start walking towards that first man. You ask his name. You listen to his story in the spirit of that accompaniment that I talked about. You had some food with you, so you share it with him. You have an extra shirt and toothpaste with you. You give that to him as well. And you guys share a meal together. After the meal is done, he gets up and starts walking with you towards that family down the path. And then together you repeat that process with that family, asking their story, understanding what their life is like. Because his immediate needs were met, and you offered that compassion, he's now in a position where he's empowered to give his gifts to others. And so that was the service piece, but the service piece is linked to the justice, because the justice work is informed by that conversation with the individuals. It's made possible by that act of charity because it gives you a better understanding of someone's experience, how someone's rights have been affected. It gives you the space to ask questions like, what was it that led to homelessness? Was it a job loss? Was it an illness? Was it just the lack of affordable housing? What led to the serious illness? Was it a lifestyle issue? Was it lack of access to preventative health care? What led to the incarceration for that parent? Was it solely bad decisions? Or was it a system that disproportionately locks up, say, people of color for drug offenses, even though we know that drug use and drug patterns are consistent across racial and income groups? So you understand these personal stories. That gives you, as an advocate, and the people that you're walking alongside, space to work on a campaign to create a different future, to create a different condition in our community around healthcare, around housing, around criminal justice. And I'll give you some concrete examples in a few minutes about how Tabor is really doing that. When we think about issues like the poor, poverty, oftentimes in society there's some simple stories that get told. And those have grains of truth in them, but they're not complete. So there's two narratives that often are out there. One is, well, they wouldn't be in that situation if they hadn't made bad decisions. And then there's another side to this conversation that says, it's not about them as individuals, it's about the system, and the system is rigged against them. And that's what determined their lack of access to X, Y, or Z service. And as often is the case in anything, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Of course, personal responsibility plays a role, and systemic factors in society play a role. Sometimes the bad decision is the likely decision because of the conditions in the neighborhood, political and economic forces that were beyond the individual's control, but the individual still has agency. So when I think about my commitment to the dignity of the human person that comes from God, I get the sense that I shouldn't be judging them or painting with a broad brush. I know that it's complicated. That's on the spiritual level. On the intellectual level, I know there's also good research that tells me that the story is more complicated than it first appears. There was a landmark study that came out a few years ago. It was called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Everybody calls that ACEs. And that showed that traumatic experiences during childhood, physical or mental or sexual abuse, neglect, a parent who's being abused in a domestic violence situation, the presence of substance abuse in the home or mental health crisis in the home, those things follow that child for their whole life. That makes them far more likely to have higher risk behaviors later in life, but also more serious health complications. And it's not just the things you might expect like depression. It's also things like diabetes and heart disease. So it's the full spectrum of things because of what happened as a child. So that research has also shown that when children are facing a traumatic experience over and over and over again, it gets the heart racing, it gets the hormones pumping, it can literally change the chemistry in your brain. And it can make it more likely that you start thinking in ways that's about immediate survival and not long-term thinking. So your brain is literally wired to make perhaps decisions that you and I might think are less rational, are less reasonable. It is not, however, the whole story. It doesn't mean if those things happen that there's no positive future for you. There are things that individuals and communities can do to protect from those bad outcomes later in life.
It involves things like strong social connections, like belonging to a church. That's powerful. Providing resources to parents so they can be better informed about how to be caregivers. It's about things like having strong mentors, people you look up to in your life. And it's also access to concrete services, like some of the services at Tabor. When those things are out there, that leads to resiliency. And then it's less likely that the ACEs that might still be happening are going to lead towards a lifelong negative consequence. For me as a leader, when I understood the ACEs research, I could be more empathetic. I could open my heart to others. And I realized that I had my own biases. I might have perceived some of the clients that I had seen at various organizations as difficult, or unwilling, or different in ways that may lead me to judge. So it's helped me shine a light on that. And I realized that in order to be in right relationship with others, and by extension Christ, I needed to do some of that self-work. It doesn't mean that I don't still hold clients accountable. I do. That's important. That's part of that walking alongside and part of being a coach. You hold high standards and you help people reach those standards. But it does mean that my mindset is different when it comes to judging. And that self-work is ongoing for me. And I do work in a place, Tabor, where that self-work is a little bit easier to do. So when we think about Tabor and this notion of the 2 feet of service, 2 feet of faith in action, service and justice, how do we stand? And we stand pretty well. We do have a commitment to showing love to people whose experiences are different than ours. We walk the walk. We were founded by somebody who I think really embodied this 2 feet of faith in action. And it's a Mennonite story. How many of you have heard of Grace Wenger? I'm sure some of you have. Yeah, Grace was a really powerful person. I never had the privilege of knowing her, but I've been reading a lot about her since I came to Tabor, and I feel the sense of kinship there. That feeling that I had when I spoke to that woman in El Paso seems to resonate with her experience she had when she was trying to find housing for her family members who had children that had been adopted from the Congo, and time after time after time, that family was being turned away from housing. So she said, you know what? Racial discrimination is not okay. She did a couple things. She published a powerful piece called No Room in Lancaster, where she basically said to people of faith, we have to do better for our black neighbors. We have to do better. The second thing she did was opened an organization that was creating new housing and creating pathways to housing for people who had experienced discrimination. That was 51 years ago, that early foundation of what became Tabor. Ever since, we've been doing some of those same things, creating access to housing, providing housing counseling so people can be successful in housing. And we have this vision that everyone in Lancaster deserves quality housing and has the potential to achieve their financial goals. So we've got this acts of service thing down. We have nearly 20 programs, and those programs are on a continuum of needs. We have programs that will literally meet people who are living on the streets where they are and have a conversation with them and invite them into service. We have a family shelter in the city called TLC. We have families who are moving from shelter into homelessness, and we're providing support there. We support couples who are buying their first home. We also work with families who maybe have been in their home for decades, and now they're facing a financial challenge, facing foreclosure, or maybe they need to consider a reverse mortgage, and we have counselors who can work with them on that too. Because we know the housing is essential to the quality of life for everybody in Lancaster. I wanted to share a little bit about one of the programs, Best Shalom, and I think we have one of our Best Shalom volunteers here. This program, to me, epitomizes the call of Matthew 25. So it's a faith-based transitional housing focused on women who have been incarcerated. They have a couple goals when they move there. One is getting reunited with their children. Being separated from their children while they were in prison, very difficult, of course, as you could imagine. The other goal is to never go back to prison, to have a future that is about being the best versions of themselves and never having to go back behind bars. So we do that in a couple different ways. The housing piece, of course. There's Bible study. There's Christian education that's part of it. There's case management with a really special case manager. There are, the women are encouraged to join a support, and a faith community rather, and then that community supports them. Oftentimes we see that substance abuse or mental health challenges are also present in those women's lives, so we can connect to those resources and make sure that aspect is being dealt with. And a few things happen over time. Stable employment happens, children get reunited, and then they move out. They move out of Beth Shalom House of Peace into their own home, and that home truly feels like a home where those women will be able to reach their goals. I had a chance to sit down with some of the residents about a month ago, and they talked to me about their hopes for getting reunited with their kids and how hard it was working with CYA, but they knew that that's what they had to do. They talked about how they're struggling with mental health and trying to get some meds worked out, or how hard it is with recovery, and every day is a challenge, but they're keeping their eye on that goal of staying sober. And one of them talked to me about education, and I said, well, why is education important to you? And she said, if I get that education, then I can get a job where my feet don't hurt all day. And that was really powerful. And it was one of those other reminders. I was like, I don't have to worry about my feet hurting all day in the job that I have. It was important for me to sort of check my privilege in that moment. In the conversation, it was clear to me that the women and Lanera, our case manager, they are partners in this work. Like I said, walking alongside. It is real at Tabor, and it's been something that's really powerful. She's their advocate. She's their cheerleader. She holds them accountable when she needs to, but they're making progress. And one example of that progress is a question that they asked. One of the women, Bianca, she asked me, is it true that Tabor can help me buy a house? What I said before about ACEs and survival thinking versus long-term thinking, that's a great example of long-term thinking, a long-term goal that she wants to work towards. And I was thinking, yes, both the answer to her question is yes, Tabor can help you with that. But yes, this safety that was created by Beth Shalom House of Peace, having her son with her again, that was creating the environment where she can start thinking longer term. Her relationship with God was getting strengthened, and that was giving her nourishment as well. So yes, we can empower Bianca and other women like her and thousands of others. Tabor does serve 5,000 people a year. And we can help them in crisis, or we can help them work on some of those long-term life milestones like buying a house. Bianca, as I said, has a son. So this isn't just the different path for Bianca. This is going to give her knowledge she can pass on to her son, and I believe give him a future that's different as well. I know as the leader of Tabor that my job is to make sure that all of us keep the clients at the heart of what we do. And if we do that, then I think we'll stay on track to actually honoring the call in Matthew's gospel. So Tabor's putting equal emphasis on the other foot of service and justice as well. One quick example there. We have a new program called Eviction Prevention Counseling. From the work we've done with homelessness for decades, we know how difficult it is for people. When they've hit rock bottom, when they're living in shelter, when their resources are gone, when maybe they've spent some time bouncing around couch to couch with friends and family, and that creates brokenness in some of those relationships. We know how difficult it is to get out of that difficult situation. But if we went just upstream, before the eviction happened, what would that look like? Evictions themselves are traumatic, right? Think about having all your possessions out front, trying to figure out where you're going to put that. Maybe trying to figure out where your possessions go leads to a job loss because your boss says, where have you been? Or maybe the new place that you find in a different neighborhood is too hard to get to work. And that stress could lead towards more serious mental health crises. Your kids might start wetting the bed or not be able to sleep at night or not do as well in school. So there's all these ripple effects from just the eviction, let alone potential homelessness. We had already been working at Tabor with many different landlords. Landlords are key partners. When people are moving out of shelter, they're going into rental units on the private market. So we need those landlords to kind of understand what we're about and what the challenges that our clients face. So we said, okay, well, what if we put that together? The relationships we have with the landlords, the experience we have working with clients, let's try to figure it out before the eviction happens. And we do three things. We work with the landlord and the tenant. We offer mediation services and say, okay, we understand, landlord, that you have a grievance here. Tenant, we understand that you had a crisis that meant you couldn't pay your bill. We're going to figure this out. The second step, we offer counseling. Like I said, walking alongside people. We need to know that this crisis won't happen again. And part of that is making sure people have good handles on their budgets. They have a sense of their credit. We work with that. And then lastly, we do have a small pot of money that we can give to the landlord to make him or her whole again if there were some arrears that the client owned. Unfortunately, this is a small project. We've only been able to serve 41 people so far this year, and we only have enough resources to serve 60 in our first year. But listen to this number. 96% of the people that we've worked with avoided eviction. 96%. I mean, it's staggering to me because it's so hard to see numbers like that in this work. And I'm thinking, okay, this is onto something. And I know how much it costs to have someone stay at our family shelter. On average, they're there for about 150 days, and that's over $4,000 to keep people supported there. But here, with this program, we're only spending about $750, including the counseling. So, a no-brainer, right? You work with people before the crisis is really bad, it's going to cost you less. But from that human perspective, they don't have to go through that trauma of eviction. And that work that I've just described is both service and justice. It is service because we are directly helping that household avoid something bad, keep them in their housing. But it's also justice because we're having conversations with landlords about the rights of tenants and their rights as landlords. We are part of a network of other agencies who are working on this eviction, and together we're all looking at how we do our work and say, should we do some things a little differently to better serve clients? So we're changing some policies there. And like I said, we have some results. I know that 96% of the people are still housed, and we can share that result with our legislators from Lancaster County. We can share that with some of the funders in this community and say, this is a model that's working. Let's try to go in that direction. And we're part of a broader conversation through an organization called Coalition for Sustainable Housing that's really looking at the housing crisis. We, unfortunately, in Lancaster County don't have enough of the kinds of housing at any income level, but particularly for people who are very low income. So we're sharing what we're learning with that group as well to make sure that people who are very vulnerable are still remembered in the conversation around housing. So I'm sure many of you are wondering how we can work together. How can East Petersburg Mennonite Church and Tabor work together? How can you as an individual work with us? So I'll give you some examples, and then I'll wrap up here. We always need volunteers, and these often are the kinds of volunteering that's about that walking alongside people. So one example would be at our family shelter. We need people who are willing to help us with things like collection drives, because people experiencing homelessness often need toiletries, sleeping bags, blankets, those kind of things. We need people who can help turn the rooms over. The shelter is an old hotel, so much like a hotel, every time somebody moves out, we want to clean the room and make it nice for the next person, and we have volunteers who help us with that. It's a 100-year-old hotel, so we need people who have maintenance skills. If you got that, we could definitely talk. And sometimes we just need ministry of presence. So there's one church that we work with who's organizing a picnic in August. So all the families staying at the shelter can come out to the county park and just have a barbecue and just be fun, have fun as families. Something as simple as that, we would love to explore those opportunities. We have the Financial Empowerment Center that I mentioned. We offer free workshops every week. Those workshops are taught by volunteer instructors. So if that's something, if you're particularly good with finance and you want to share that with others, we would love to have you. We have a wonderful group of development volunteers, many of whom come from a church in Ephrata. They are putting out thousands of mailings every year for us. They help us do our special events. If that's something that you're good at, if you're very organized, we would love to have you be part of that. Beth Shalom, as I mentioned, that's a faith-based program, so one of our big needs for volunteers there is around people who are willing to teach Christian life skills to the women. So that's another opportunity. That would be a monthly service opportunity. There's other ways to partner, of course. We do pride ourselves as being good stewards of our donors' money, and many congregations do choose to contribute. But we also have a real need for in-kind support. And we have these baskets that we ask our partners to put together that really set up the people we serve for success. So there's one called the Bright Hope Basket. And it's a laundry basket, and we fill it with dish soap and laundry soap and a mop and a broom and a dustpan and brush and some cleaning sprays and sponges. When individuals move from homelessness into a home, this is one of the things that we can hand to them so that they can keep their house clean. And that's something that seems very simple that maybe we take for granted, but it is so powerful. We also have a big event coming up this November that I would love to see you be part of. It's going to be our second annual Camp Out for Homelessness. How many of you have heard of the Extraordinary Give that the Community Foundation puts on? So this is Tabor's way to plug into that energy of that night. We're partnering with Clipper Magazine Stadium, and we're going to have the field, and we're going to be able to put tents on that field, and we're inviting youth groups and churches and college students and individuals in the community to come out and spend a night in solidarity with people who do have to sleep outside, for people who are experiencing homelessness. We know it's not the same thing, of course, but we know it's a way to understand on a more human level what that is like. And as part of the Extra Give, we'll also have a chance to raise some money for the work to fight homelessness in Lancaster. I mentioned another group, the Coalition for Sustainable Housing. Tabor is part of a number of these coalitions. There's Hunger Free Lancaster County. There's the Coalition to Combat Poverty. I could also connect you to those groups as well if you're really called to that justice work. But lastly, the way we can do this in meaningful partnership has nothing to do with a service opportunity or a justice work. It has to do more with what's in our heart. It's hard to have authentic relationships with people who are facing the hardships of hunger or illness or imprisonment if we haven't done the work in our own interior life. So I talked to you about how understanding ACEs helped me address some of my own biases. We all have these barriers, and it's different for every one of us. But I ask that you start thinking about those too. I had a college professor who I went and spoke with about sort of hearing the call of vocation and how could I honor that. And she told me to do a couple things that I've tried to practice ever since. She said, Mike, you need to seek spiritual direction. And she said, you should never lose contact with people who are poor. And I said, okay. And that was quite some years ago, and it has served me well ever since. So I invite you to consider her advice as well. So it was seek spiritual direction and never lose contact with people who are poor. So if we do these things, I'm confident that together, both Tabor and East Petersburg Mennonite Church, but also the community here in Lancaster in general, I feel like we'll truly walk alongside the people who Jesus called the least of these. And in so doing, we will be walking towards him. So thank you for your time this morning.